Governor General of India. It's not just left to the East India Company to decide who is going to govern Britain's territories in India. Or India doesn't exist at this point, in basically in and around Bengal. You have basically two philosophies of government developing in India in the late 18th and early 19th century. One is a so-called, and both of which are aimed at trying to deliver what they call the improvement of India. Okay? One is an Orientalist philosophy, which is basically those who valorize Indian culture and often valorize Indian society, and thought that the corrupt and tyrannical forms of rule of the Mughals had led the country into destitution, and that restoring the sort of ancient foundations of Indian culture would help revive and bring a new renaissance to the country. Okay? The others had a belief, basically, in we might describe them as universalists. That is to say that they believed strongly that their very often liberal ideas had a universal application and were as true in India as they were in Britain. And it's basically the universalists that win out over the Orientalists during the 19th century. And they win out through some of the key figures that you've already learnt about, okay? Passing new types of reform. So very famously, you have Macaulay's Minute on Education, which you just have read, going in 1835. Trevelyan, who you know from last Tuesday, was in India in 1853 and passed the reform of the civil service. There's reforms of land tenure and of taxation. There's reforms of the penal code, okay? All of which are in many ways enacting the very types of liberal reforms that reformers want to introduce in Britain, but can't because they believe they're effectively blocked by the entrenched interests of aristocratic institutions and powers. So did you get a sense from Macaulay's Minute of Education of the level of sort of cultural chauvinism at work in this belief of how important the application of English principles in India were? What's he arguing in that Minute of Education, Minute on Education? Yeah.
I think cultural chauvinism is it was just pretty much saying that like there's no point in teaching English or teaching people in India in Arabic or Spanish if they're teaching them English, and because the English language just gives them access to all the correct things to know about the world and much higher level of literature and philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, he had those great phrases that, you know, that whole libraries in Sanskrit are worth but, you know, a single bookshelf of those in the English language. And what is his aim in introducing English as the language of education in India? What does he want to produce? Yeah. He does want to make them a better people, and he wants them to make them more English, but, yeah?
I thought that by teaching them English and all the like literature and stuff, he will be able to make a class of people who will like reform their own.
Right. So the idea is to create little Britons, okay? Mini-me's, if you like, okay? Basically replicas of the British gentleman. Yeah, that it is only by mastering the arts of English that you can become culturally sophisticated and a English gentleman. So India becomes, in the hands of these reformers, a type of laboratory where they can enact these very reforms that they are, you know, terribly eager to do in Britain, and where they're unchecked, precisely because there's no civil society. There's no representative institutions and no a way in which the people of India can resist their reforms or block their reforms. Now, and throughout this time, the territorial basis of British rule in India is expanding. Okay, they're annexing and more and more territory. Okay, and the last great example of that was the annexation of Oudh in 1856, which becomes the heart of the rebellion in 1857. Now, last point I want to make, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The revolt is seen to play a critical role in the history of India as the first great nationalist rebellion. Okay, very important place in the history of Indian nationalism, and it also has a critical place in the history of the British Empire, which is to say that many people think that the revolt is a turning point in the nature of British rule. That what you have after the revolt, which they see as this great mutiny, how is it that these people that we're trying to give culture and sophistication can revolt against us? So it's seen as a mutiny, and as a consequence of that, they no longer think that their principles should be universally true or equally applied. And instead, that what happens, it is argued, is an increasing theorization of racial difference and the application of a different set of rules and laws and forms of governing in colonial territories. Okay, so very important moment in the history of India and in the history of the British Empire. So let me briefly say some words about the revolt. I'm sorry that this image is so grimy. The Crimean War in Europe in 1853 to 1856 had highlighted, I mean basically every war does this, but the Crimean War did it very effectively, had highlighted the ineffectiveness of the British military. And there followed a great wave of attempts to modernise the British military. And these reforming impulses were also projected upon the Indian Army, which played a vitally strategic role for the British Empire. Because the Indian Army was used not just in India, but in Britain's colonial wars throughout Southeast Asia and up in further, in Afghanistan and so forth. So there is an attempt to bring these modernizing reforms into the Indian Army. And the Indian Army had been based in Bengal. Okay, it had been a very high status institution. Bengalis had been allowed to retain their caste rules and distinctions, and the new reforms basically challenged those privileges and sought to remove the caste privileges, had extended the requirements of overseas service, which were deeply popular, introduced a new type of rifle, and critically had that rifle required pig or cow fat to grease the cartridges. So it was the quickest way possible to outrage Hindus and Muslims, okay, who were in the service of this army, to make them have to use pig and cow fat. So this whole series of attempts at modernizing reforms basically outraged and led to this rebellion, of which the aim was to march to Delhi and declare the last Mughal ruler an emperor of a new kingdom of Hindustan. And so the revolt, which was primarily contained up in the northwest of India, up in Oudh and down to Calcutta and across to Delhi. It very quickly spread across this region and took over a year to contain and defeat. And critically, that defeat only came as a consequence of the use of indigenous soldiers. Okay? Took way too long and was way too difficult to get British military shipped out from Britain. In any case, the British military the army was very, very small. So relied upon the use of indigenous soldiers, primarily Sikhs, and they'll have more to say about that in a moment. What you had very quickly in Britain was a certain projection of this revolt as a mutiny, and to try and play up the barbaric and disordered nature of the revolt. So here you have this, the sepoy Indian troops dividing the spoils after their mutiny against British rule. Okay? And you can see that there's plunder. It's meant to be a completely unprincipled rebellion. It's just about looting and rioting. And worse still, in British eyes, it became projected around a whole series of sieges around key towns, where British residents of these towns were held siege by those in revolt, leading the British residents in those towns to have to face very, very harsh conditions where they're eating dogs and horses, and they run out of food, and when the rebellion, when those in revolt come in, there's meant to be rape and pillage and murder of British women, children, British women and children. Back in Britain, this led to complete outrage. Absolute outrage. How was it that these heathen people could do such things to these, to our proud people serving in India? There's only one dissenting voice really in Britain, and that is Ernest Jones, one of the Chartist leaders, who was editing a paper called the People's Paper. Only Jones can test this account of savagery and the atrocities that the British press had so widely spread. So, why does this revolt fail? Same question that we had for the British case. First thing that happens is that the East India Company is effectively, what's the word? Can't think of the word. Very bad thing in this line of business to forget a word. The East India Company is basically replaced as the governing authority of India, and direct rule from London is instituted instead.